Joseph Big Joe Thompson shuffled into Henderson's auto shop in Detroit with holes in his shoes and clothes he hadn't changed for 3 days, clutching a worn bag containing the last tools he couldn't bring himself to sell for food. The smell of motor oil and metal filled his lungs like the perfume of a lost home, while 4 mechanics in blue coveralls looked at him with a mixture of pity and annoyance. At 60, with an unkempt beard and hands that shook not from age but from hunger, he looked like just another homeless man seeking charity. When he whispered those words that would change everything, the young men burst out laughing, thinking it was the usual joke of a desperate vagrant. What they didn't know was that they were mocking Joseph Thompson, the legendary motor magician, the man who had won the Indianapolis 500 3 times, who had transformed scrap metal into NASCAR champions, who had made entire generations dream with his impossible creations. A genius who had fallen into oblivion after an accident that destroyed his career and family, now reduced to begging for work in the shop where 40 years earlier he had entered as a champion. But when the owner's Corvette refused to start, and no one could figure out the problem, fate was about to reveal who this man everyone believed was finished really was. Henderson's auto shop breathed with that morning frenzy typical of Detroit garages, with the 4 mechanics, Mike, Jake, Tony, and Steve, preparing for another day of work among German BMWs and luxury Audis. None of them was yet 30, all raised in the digital age of onboard computers and electronic diagnostics, accustomed to solving problems by connecting cables and reading error codes on displays. Joseph Thompson crossed the threshold of that temple of modern mechanics like a ghost from the past. The man entering seemed to emerge from another era, disheveled white hair, unkempt beard, clothes that had once been elegant, but now showed signs of nights spent outdoors. His hands were those of someone who had worked a lifetime with iron and steel, gnarled, full of small scars, but with still slender fingers that spoke of surgical precision lost in time. At 60, Joseph looked 70. 3 years of street life after the final bankruptcy had carved deep furrows not only in his face, but also in his soul. The man who 40 years earlier had made the entire world dream with his impossible engines now barely held a canvas bag containing the last tools remaining from selling his estate. His story was that of a meteor that had illuminated the sky of motorsports only to plummet into total oblivion. Joseph Thompson, nicknamed the Motor Magician by the international press of the 70s and 80s, had revolutionized the racing world with innovations that seemed like science fiction. He had won the Indianapolis 500 3 consecutive times between 1975 and 1977, with engines he designed and built by hand, had developed the fuel injection system that still equipped the most powerful American muscle cars. In 1987, during tests for what should have been his supreme creation, a vehicle capable of exceeding 250 miles per hour, a structural failure had caused an accident that killed the test driver and seriously injured Joseph himself. The legal proceedings, the million-dollar lawsuits, the loss of all patents to pay damages had transformed the genius into a ruined man. In the 90s, he had desperately tried to rebuild, opening small shops that closed one after another. His wife had left him in 1995, taking their only son, tired of living with a man who only talked about engines he no longer built. The final collapse had come 3 years earlier, when even the last small shop had closed. Joseph found himself on the streets at 57, forced to sleep in his car until he had to sell that too. The 4 young mechanics exchanged amused glances when Joseph asked if he could fix something in exchange for a hot meal. Mike, the youngest of the group, couldn't even suppress a chuckle at what seemed like another desperate man seeking charity. Fate had decided to play its best cards at precisely that moment. From the back of the shop came the unmistakable sound of a V8 engine that stubbornly refused to start, followed by a series of curses. It was Jim Henderson, the owner, struggling with his 2018 Corvette Z06 that hadn't shown signs of life for 3 days. Jim had already tried everything: battery replacement, ignition system check, sensor verification, even complete diagnostics that revealed no errors. The $80,000 machine had become a very expensive paperweight. The four mechanics approached the Corvette like moths drawn to flame, each confident he could solve the problem. But after 2 hours of attempts, the car remained as silent as a luxury tomb. Joseph had observed the entire scene from afar, standing near the entrance, with that infinite patience that only those who have lived much can afford. His eyes followed every movement of the young mechanics, and slowly, imperceptibly, he began to smile. It wasn't a smile of mockery, but of understanding. When Jim emerged from under the hood with his face red with rage, Joseph found the courage to approach. He asked if he could take a look at the machine. The 5 men looked at him as if he were crazy. Jim, exasperated, was about to send him away when Joseph added something that stopped everyone in their tracks. He said he recognized that type of problem, that he had seen it on a similar car when he worked with Zora Arkus Duntov himself at Chevrolet. The name pronounced with such naturalness created a different silence in the shop. Jim looked more closely at that man and for the first time noticed his hands. They were hands that had definitely worked with engines. This was undeniable. He decided to give him 5 minutes. Joseph approached the Corvette with the religious respect reserved for works of art. His hands began exploring the engine with sure movements, not random like those of the young mechanics, but guided by deep knowledge that seemed to come from an ancestral part of the brain. He didn't touch computers or diagnostic instruments. He simply listened, smelled, felt the machine with all his senses. After 10 minutes of absolute silence, Joseph raised his head and made a diagnosis that left everyone stunned. The problem wasn't in the electrical system, nor in the sensors, nor in the onboard computer. It was a microfracture in a small tube of the fuel tank ventilation system, so tiny it couldn't be detected visually, but sufficient to create pressure that prevented fuel from flowing correctly. When Jim verified the diagnosis and discovered it was 100% correct, the world of Henderson's auto shop changed forever. The repair took less than an hour in Joseph's hands, but those 60 minutes radically transformed the atmosphere of the place. Jim observed every movement with growing amazement, while the 4 young men gradually approached, abandoning derision for increasingly intense curiosity. Joseph worked in almost religious silence, with precise and economical gestures that spoke of decades of experience. He didn't consult manuals or use electronic diagnostic tools. His hands seemed to know every component of that V8 engine, as if he had designed them personally. When he finally turned the key and the engine awakened with its glorious roar, a silence charged with meaning fell over the shop. Jim looked at Joseph with completely different eyes. Curiosity was stronger than caution, and he began asking increasingly direct questions. Who was this man, really? How could he diagnose problems that escaped the most modern instruments? Joseph hesitated before answering. It had been years since anyone had asked about his past with sincere interest. Slowly, with his voice becoming firmer with each word, he began to tell his story. He spoke of his years at Chevrolet in the 70s, when the Corvette division was still more experimental laboratory than industry. He told how he had developed the cooling system that allowed Corvettes to compete with European supercars in endurance racing. The 4 young men listened with mouths agape. Mike, who had been laughing an hour earlier, now hung on his every word when he explained how he had solved the vibration problem on V8 engines. Jake took mental notes when Joseph explained why modern electronic systems couldn't replace an experienced mechanic's ear in identifying engine anomalies. It was when Jim asked for his full name that the atmosphere changed completely. The answer, Joseph Thompson, fell into the shop like lightning. Jim visibly started, as if he had heard the name of a ghost. Joseph Thompson, the motor magician, the man who had made a generation of motorsports enthusiasts dream. Jim perfectly remembered that name because, as a boy, he had watched the Indianapolis 500 victories on television, had read in specialized magazines about the incredible records set by cars designed by Thompson. What he didn't know was that the legend had lived through hell that had reduced him to these conditions. The 1987 accident, the trials, the bankruptcy, family abandonment, the recent years on the streets. Jim's reaction was immediate. He couldn't allow a living legend to continue living on the streets. He offered Joseph a job in the shop, a place to sleep, a decent salary. But above all, he offered him the possibility of returning to do what he was born for, transforming cold iron into mechanical poetry. Joseph accepted with tears in his eyes. After 3 years on the streets, he had found not only a job, but his lost identity. He was Joseph Thompson, the motor magician, once again. The following months transformed Henderson's auto shop into something no one had ever seen. Joseph wasn't simply another mechanic. He had become the teacher the 4 young men didn't know they were looking for. His presence had brought a new dimension to daily work, transforming routine repairs into mechanical lessons that no school could ever teach. Mike, Jake, Tony, and Steve had completely abandoned the technological superiority attitude of the first days. Now they followed Joseph like disciples hungry for knowledge, discovering that there existed a world of mechanical wisdom that computers couldn't codify. They learned to hear the voice of engines, to recognize problems from the smell of oil, to understand vibrations that told stories of worn components. Joseph had found not only the dignity of work, but also the joy of transmitting his knowledge. Every morning he arrived at the shop with a child's enthusiasm, ready to face new mechanical challenges and share secrets he had guarded for decades. Jim had arranged a small apartment above the shop for him, where Joseph had begun slowly rebuilding his life. The shop's fame began spreading through the neighborhood, then throughout Detroit. Customers no longer came just for ordinary repairs, but hoped to see the legendary Joseph Thompson at work. Classic car owners, collectors, even professional drivers began making pilgrimages to the small suburban shop. The turning point came when Marcus Williams, owner of a 1967 Shelby GT 500, brought his historic car with a problem that no other shop in Detroit had been able to solve. The $2 million machine suffered from unexplained power loss. 3 specialized shops had declared the case unsolvable, without complete engine overhaul. Joseph accepted the challenge with the humility of someone who had learned to respect every car, regardless of its value. He spent an entire day with the Shelby, not dismantling components.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
But simply listening, touching, smelling every part of the engine. The 4 young men observed him in silence, fascinated by that diagnostic process that seemed more art than science. The solution was as elegant as it was invisible. Joseph identified a microscopic imperfection in the carburetor machining, a defect that in 1967 had gone unnoticed, but after 56 years was causing suboptimal combustion. With a thin file and surgeon's precision, he corrected the imperfection in less than an hour. When the Shelby returned to roaring with all its original power, Marcus Williams was speechless. Before leaving, he made Joseph a proposal that changed everything. Would he be willing to work as a consultant for his vintage racing car restoration team? The proposal opened to Joseph a world he thought was lost forever. He began collaborating with private collectors, specialized auction houses, restoration teams working on legendary cars. His reputation quickly spread through the international circuit of enthusiasts, where the name Joseph Thompson returned to being spoken with respect. But Joseph never forgot his rediscovered origins. He continued working at Henderson's auto shop, teaching the 4 young men, repairing everyday cars with the same care dedicated to million-dollar classics. Jim had seen the business triple, but above all had seen the birth of a school where mechanics returned to being an art passed from master to student. The winter of 2020 brought into Joseph's life an opportunity that seemed to emerge from his most impossible dreams. David Martinez, director of the National Automotive Museum in Reno, Nevada, presented himself at Henderson's auto shop with a revolutionary proposal. The museum was organizing an exhibition on the great innovators of American motorsports, and Joseph Thompson was to be its absolute protagonist. The proposal went beyond simple display of memorabilia. Martinez wanted Joseph to reconstruct from nothing one of his legendary creations, the Thompson T75, the race car that in 1975 had dominated Indianapolis with futuristic technical solutions. The original project had been lost in the fire of 1988, but Joseph preserved in his memory every detail of that extraordinary machine. Jim encouraged Joseph to accept, understanding that this was an unrepeatable opportunity. Henderson's auto shop became headquarters for the most ambitious project Joseph had ever faced in his second life. The four young mechanics were transformed into a team of specialists under the master's guidance. Mike handled the body work, learning aluminum working techniques from the 70s. Jake became an expert on suspensions, studying the geometries Joseph had invented to optimize road holding. Tony specialized in adapting modern systems to original specifications. Steve was initiated into the mysteries of engine preparation, discovering how to transform an iron block into mechanical artwork. The project required 8 months of intensive work, during which Joseph demonstrated he still possessed intact the genius that had made him famous. But there was something different in his current approach. Where once there had been frantic pursuit of absolute perfection, now reigned patient wisdom that made every decision more thoughtful and effective. The reconstruction of the Thompson T75 became an event that attracted attention from the entire motorsports world. Specialized journalists, automotive engineers, famous drivers began visiting Henderson's auto shop to witness the rebirth of a legend. Joseph welcomed everyone with the same humility that had characterized his second life. The most emotional moment came when Joseph, now 61, got behind the wheel of a race car for the first time in 33 years. The T75 test took place at the Michigan International Speedway, just miles from the shop where he had rediscovered his calling. When the car streaked across the track with its unmistakable sound of a V8 engine prepared to original specifications, it seemed time had jumped back 40 years. Joseph drove for 20 laps, testing the machine's reactions, verifying that every component functioned as he had dreamed decades before. At the test's end, he emerged from the cockpit with tears in his eyes. They weren't tears of nostalgia, but of gratitude for being able to close a circle that seemed destined to remain forever open. The exhibition at the National Automotive Museum in Reno was an absolute triumph. The reconstructed Thompson T75 became the main attraction, but Joseph amazed everyone with his humility. During the inauguration, before hundreds of personalities from the motorsports world, he dedicated the success to the four young mechanics of Henderson's auto shop, attributing to them the merit of making the project's rebirth possible. Mike, Jake, Tony, and Steve, elegant in their dark suits, felt invested with new responsibility. They were no longer simple mechanics, but custodians of a tradition Joseph was passing to them. That evening, they understood that the master's true legacy wasn't patents or trophies, but the knowledge he was transferring into their hands. In the following months, the four students grew to become masters themselves. Mike opened a second location specializing in classic cars. Jake became consultant to several NASCAR teams for suspensions. Tony founded a startup producing electronic control units for vintage cars. Steve became the most sought-after engine builder in America for vintage racing cars. But all continued considering Henderson's auto shop their spiritual home, where every Wednesday evening they gathered for the master's lesson. Joseph, seated on an old chair among cars under repair, told stories, explained techniques, shared that philosophy of mechanics that went beyond simple technical aspects. International fame had brought Joseph job offers from around the world. Prestigious automotive companies, billionaire collectors, international museums tried to secure him with million-dollar economic offers. But Joseph always declined, explaining he had found his ideal dimension in that Detroit shop, where every day he could continue learning something new. The event that definitively consecrated Joseph Thompson's return was the invitation to the Indianapolis 500 in 2023, 50 years after his first victory. The race organizers wanted to honor him by having him wave the checkered flag for the final lap. When Joseph, dressed in Henderson's auto shop coveralls instead of an elegant suit, climbed the podium, the entire speedway exploded in applause that lasted 10 minutes. The most moving moment came when the four students climbed the podium together with the master, officially recognized as the living legacy of Joseph Thompson. C2, it was the first time in Indianapolis 500 history that a mechanic was honored alongside his disciples, in recognition that motorsports' true value lies in transmitting knowledge from one generation to another. That evening, Joseph received a phone call that moved him more than all official recognitions. It was his son Michael, now 40, and an aerospace engineer in Seattle, who had followed the ceremony on live television. Father and son hadn't spoken for 20 years, but seeing Joseph return to prominence had pushed Michael to overcome past resentments. Their meeting, a few weeks later at Henderson's auto shop, was charged with emotions held back too long. Michael admitted he had always followed his father's career from afar, had been proud of his successes, but also frightened by his failures. Seeing Joseph rebuild his life starting from nothing, never losing dignity, had convinced him it was time to recover their lost relationship. Joseph welcomed his son with the same humility he reserved for everyone entering the shop. There were no reproaches for years of silence, no recriminations about the past. Only joy at being able to share with Michael the wisdom gained through suffering and rebirth. 3 years after the Reno exhibition, Henderson's auto shop had become something more than a mechanical laboratory. It was a pilgrimage site for anyone wanting to understand the true essence of motorsports. Joseph Thompson, now 64 but with enviable vitality, had transformed that small space into a cathedral of mechanics, where the miracle of transforming metal into movement was daily celebrated. Jim had repeatedly proposed that Joseph become a partner in the shop, but Joseph had always refused, preferring the role of guardian of mechanical memory. His salary was enough to live with dignity in the small apartment above the shop, and his true wealth was the human relationships built during those years of rebirth. Henderson's auto shop continued living and thriving, now famous worldwide as Joseph Thompson School. Every day young mechanics arrived from every continent, hoping to be accepted as apprentices by the master. And Joseph welcomed them all, recognizing in each the poor boy hungry for knowledge he himself had been 60 years earlier. His story had become legend, but a living legend that continued growing and transforming daily. Joseph had learned life's most important lesson, that true success isn't measured by what you obtain for yourself, but by what you manage to leave others. And his legacy, made of mechanical wisdom, conquered humility, and transmitted passion, would continue inspiring generations of mechanics long after his name became just a memory. The man who had asked to fix cars in exchange for food had become immortal in the most beautiful way possible, through the hands and hearts of those he had been able to touch with his rediscovered humanity. Every engine that purred in the shop, every young person learning to feel the soul of machines, every repair performed with love and skill bore the invisible mark of his teaching. Joseph had demonstrated that true genius never dies. It can only be temporarily buried by circumstances. And when it finds the path to re-emerge, it illuminates not only one's own life, but that of everyone fortunate enough to encounter it. The legend of the motor magician continued, written daily with oil and sweat, passion and humility, in a small suburban shop where dreams return to take shape in the wise hands of those who know how to transform iron into poetry. The homeless man who had begged for work had become a beacon of hope, proving that redemption is always possible when someone believes in you enough to offer a second chance. In the heart of Detroit, where the American automotive dream was born, Joseph Thompson had shown that legends never truly die. They just wait for the right moment to rise again, stronger and wiser than before. Like if you believe talent has no age or social condition. Comment which moment in Joseph's story moved you most. Share to inspire those who think it's too late to start over. Subscribe for more stories of redemption and second chances that change lives. Sometimes those who ask for charity hide misunderstood genius. Sometimes the wisest hands belong to those who have hit rock bottom. And sometimes it takes just believing in someone to bring a lost legend back to life. Because a person's true worth isn't measured by where they come from, but by where they can go when someone offers them a second chance.